Good evening, everyone, and welcome to the annual Padnos Public Engagement Lecture on Jewish Learning. It is so good to see you. Thank you so much for coming to our campus this evening. My name is Kyle Clears. I use he, him pronouns. I am the Director of Operations for the Kaufman Interfaith Institute here at Grand Valley State University. This evening's lecture, entitled How Women Changed American Religion, A Jewish Perspective, is the result of a partnership between the Jean and Samuel Frankel Center for Judaic Studies at the University of Michigan and the Sylvia and Richard Kaufman Interfaith Institute here at Grand Valley State University. We are so thrilled to welcome Dr. Carla Goldman to GVSU as our guest speaker for this event. And thank you to our friends at the Frankel Center for working with us on creating this wonderful space for learning. The Kaufman Institute offers a broad range of programming that advances equity and belonging for persons of all religious, spiritual, and secular identities by fostering human connection, interfaith understanding, and collective transformation on our campus and in the wider West Michigan community. Gatherings like this one bring voice to traditionally silenced or overlooked histories and identities as we grapple with religion in the U.S. and ask the questions of who has the right to shape and tell those narratives. And so in living into that work, we want to begin our time here by pausing to acknowledge the land on which we gather this evening. We recognize the people of the three fires, the Ojibwe, the Odawa, and the Potawatomi peoples on whose land we are gathered on this evening. The Three Fires people are indigenous to this land, which means that this is their ancestral territory. We recognize that this continent has long been home to many expressions of indigenous spiritualities that over the centuries have been actively suppressed and outlawed. As an interfaith organization, the Kaufman Institute has a particular responsibility to acknowledge the role that faith communities have played in the histories of broken treaties, forced removal, cultural erasure, and genocide of Native persons. Naming this and the enduring presence of our Native communities is the first way that we can step into this work of developing right relations. And so I encourage everyone to live into this essential work of justice by supporting the Grand River Band of Odawa Indians in their ongoing efforts to secure federal recognition. So please, by all means, visit grandriverbands.com/takeaction for more information or to contact your local legislators. So once again, thank you so much to those here in the room and those who are joining us over the live stream online for your gift of time and your attendance in this evening's event. At this time, I'd like to introduce Maya Barzili, Professor of Hebrew Literature and Jewish Culture at U of M and Director of the Frankel Center for Judaic Studies, to introduce our speaker this evening and give a little context for this lecture. So Maya, welcome to Grand Valley. I'll also just say I wore my maize and blue bow tie tonight as a sign of, so welcome.
Yeah, thank you so much. Thank you, Kyle. Thank you for that lovely introduction, and really good evening, everyone. We're so glad you could join us this evening. Whether you're here in person or through live streaming, we welcome you. My name is Maya Barzilai, and I'm the director of the Frankel Center for Judaic Studies at the University of Michigan. It gives me great pleasure to introduce our speaker, Professor Carla Goldman, and tonight's lecture, and you have the title. This year marks, as you can see, our 5th annual Padnos Public Engagement Lecture, but it's our 4th in-person event in collaboration with Grand Valley State University, enabled through the generous gift of the Stuart and Barbara Padnos Foundation. The Padnos Public Engagement event on Jewish learning is part of a broader mission to promote Jewish and interfaith studies across the state with a focus on connecting faculty, students, and fellows at the Frankel Center with audiences in West Michigan. So a little bit of background on the Padnos family and their connection to the University of Michigan, because you all know them as the Grand Rapids, through your Grand Rapids connection. Members of the Padnos family have been, as you know, business and community leaders in Michigan for over a century. In 1988, the late Stuart and Barbara Padnos established a visiting professorship in Jewish studies at the University of Michigan, named after Helen and Louis Padnos. In addition to teaching on the Ann Arbor campus, the visiting Padnos professor used to travel to Grand Rapids to provide a lecture to students, alumni, and friends. So that was a long-standing tradition. We used to have this Padnos visiting professor, and I'm jumping forward a few decades, and currently Daniel, Jeffrey, and Douglas Padnos have carried on their parents' vision and incredible generosity through this endowed yearly lecture, as well as the recent gift of the Padnos Family Professorship in Jewish Thought. So we now will have a permanent faculty member and our Jewish Studies Center holding this endowed professorship. Yes, I want to applaud there. It is an amazing gift and a gift of vision for the future. I'm deeply grateful to the Padnos family for their staunch commitment to education on Jewish and interreligious subject matters and their support of the Frankel Center for Judaic Studies at the University of Michigan. Please join me in applauding, and we just did, but we can do that again, their contribution to promoting the values of mutual understanding and Jewish learning, which are even more urgently needed right now in these times. So, yes. This event was also made possible through our partnership that Kyle talked about at GVSU, and I wish to thank the Kaufman Interfaith Institute. I want to thank Doug Kinchy, our longtime partner, and Kyle Kuyers, who's also been a huge supporter for tonight's program. In Ann Arbor, our Frankel Center Communications and Events Coordinator, Caitlin Gordon, has been tirelessly promoting this event, and Samantha Steers, the Regional Director of Development at the University of Michigan, has provided essential support and coordination. So we couldn't make this happen without all their support. Yes, thank you. And now to our talk. Tonight we are so fortunate to hear from an expert on many topics, including feminism, gender roles, and activism within Jewish communities. Goldman is the Saul Drackler Professor of Social Work and Professor of Jewish Studies at U of M. She directs the Jewish Communal Leadership Program, a social work graduate degree program that prepares students for a variety of professional undertakings within Jewish communities and beyond. She holds a PhD in American history from Harvard University and has worked at Hebrew Union College, Cincinnati, and the Jewish Women's Archive before joining the University of Michigan faculty in 2008. Dr. Goldman's research focuses on the history of American Jews with special attention to the evolving roles and contributions of American Jewish women. In her book, Beyond the Synagogue Gallery, Finding a Place for Women in American Judaism, appeared with Harvard University Press. She has published numerous essays on American Reform Judaism, the history of Cincinnati Jews and their religious institutions, and women's roles in Jewish communal life from the late 19th century to the present. Goldman is also dedicated to the study of Jewish experience in higher education and has devoted recent attention to the history of Jews at U of M as part of the Inclusive History Project. And she can tell you, of course, more about that. An educator and scholar of education and religious movements, Dr. Goldman embodies the spirit of the Padnos Public Engagement Lecture Series, which aims to reach a broader public across our two campuses. Her talk today will show how the notion of American Judaism should be understood as constantly evolving, just as religious behavior and practice have shifted because of changes in women's roles and gender expectations, and as a result of the exchange with non-Jewish models and the broader American society. So, without further ado, please join me in warmly welcoming Dr. Goldman. We hope you will stay also for a lively Q&A and discussion after her talk, followed by dessert outside. So we really thank you for being here and being on the live stream, and we look forward to your talk. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you, Maya. Hi. Really nice to be here. We've got a quick a lovely dose of Grand Rapids, a slight small architectural tour, and a very nice dinner, and also just a chance to sort of meet some new friends and reconnect with some old ones, who actually appear in this talk. So that's sort of amazing. And I did not know I was going to see them until I got here. So think about what's going on here. So there was an interest in this talk in thinking about how American Judaism is part of the American religious scene. And I started off thinking about a very important article that was written by scholar Ann Braude, appeared in 1997. And as you can see, it was called "Women's History is American Religious History." I guess it's how do we put the emphasis? Women's history is American religious history. And in some ways, a lot of the work that I've done tries to make the argument that Jewish women's history is American Jewish history. That is, you can't understand the development of American Judaism without really paying attention in a consistent way to changing roles for women and how that reshaped and reshaped the ways that American Jews thought about and practiced being Jewish. All cultures that are sensitive to the judgment and gaze of the surrounding society, right? And think about it, that American Jews have historically and today been very sensitive to the ways that others in the society see them, have especially needed to pay attention to gender roles, right? Because those are always quite fraught in our society. Sometimes we notice it, like now, right? They're very contested about what is gender. Sometimes we don't notice it. But whether or not we notice it, it's always there. It's always evolving. It's always fraught. I had a long conversation with my students last night about sitcoms. And if you think about sort of ones that, however old you are, if you watch TV, and we're American, right? All of them are about what are the proper roles for girls and boys, for men and women. And that carries on today. Just a sort of indication of that. And that this fraughtness and this need to respond to sort of changing expectations is something that shapes the way we live, certainly, but certainly shapes our religion. I just want to note, this is today's New York Times. I saw this last night. I found it in the actual paper this morning. I actually think it changed a little bit from last night because in a way it made Braude's argument. It said, well, it seems like we've been seeing American religion sort of declining, particularly American Christianity, and now it's rising a little bit. And why? Because younger men are more interested in religion, right? So rather than looking at sort of, here it makes the point, right? Women in American history have always been the ones who identify with religion, right? This one starts in the 1940s, but we're going to talk about today how this goes back to the 1700s, right? And that what's significant in this article is that it's shrinking, right? But last night, at least as I read the article, it sort of told the story through men. But really, if you think about it, it's the story of women, right? Women becoming less religious means that America becomes less religious. Now, thankfully for the rabbis who are present, there's a suggestion that this at least may not be declining as much as it was, right? But the story is still very much about gender in today's New York Times. So lots of coincidences today. And this is sort of a reflection of those numbers, right, of a decline both of, mainly of women, right, in their interests. So also notice, the group we're thinking about tonight is this bottom line, right? Which actually looks, I don't know what that tells us about Judaism and other religions in the US, but I think I'm going to try and make the argument that no matter how flat the line is, there's always something to look at there and try to understand, okay? All right, so let's jump back from February 27th, 2025 to begin this story. So, if you think about it, I think if most of us think about the impact of women's changing roles on American religion, it would probably be pretty common to say, well, the place you're going to see that most powerfully would be in recent decades, right? In American Judaism, we point to about 50 years ago, the ordination of the first American woman rabbi, Sally Priesand, which was in 1972. And from there, and we'll talk about it a little bit at the end, lots of things have happened, right? And sort of say, before that, women were in traditional roles, religion was sort of standard around gender. And what I hope to show you tonight is that's never been the case, right? That these evolving roles, as Maya put it, are ones that have always really shaped and evolving Judaism and other American religions as well. So I'm going to argue that to find these changes, we don't want to look at the last 50 years. We actually want to look at the last 300. We don't have that much time. So I'm going to talk about sort of three sort of features of those changes. The first one is about physical structures. I like to start with the synagogue, even though we don't think of the traditional synagogue as being a place where women had much of a place, right? Traditionally, we think about Judaism, traditional Judaism, and the public space of the synagogue as a very male space. So I'm going to have to think about why I'm choosing to start with the synagogue. Then I want to talk about sort of changing boundaries of community, ideas of really the synagogue community, and then take a look at women's religious leadership and what that has meant. I'm going to spend the most time on the physical structure and then try to move us quickly through those other things. I always like this. We already, as we took a look, Maya and I visited 2 synagogues already today in Grand Rapids, so it shows you where my interest lies. Okay, so what is this? It says synagogue. Pretty simple structure. This is, as you can see, the Mill Street Synagogue, or representation of the Mill Street Synagogue in New York City. New York, I don't know if it was New York City then, in 1730. This congregation, Shereth Israel, we'll see some other versions, some other iterations of Shereth Israel. They claim to have started in 1654 when the first collective group of Jews arrived on the shores of what would become the United States. We're not sure if they really started a synagogue as soon as they got there, but it does go back into the 17th century. So why do we have this image? So this is from this really interesting map of New York. You can see it was done in 1813, but it was according to the memory of David Grimm from the 1740s, which is an interesting thing. So this map is bigger than what you're seeing, but what's interesting is this top part of the map, which showed sort of the major buildings in the city. And these cities were mainly, there's the poorhouse, city hall, and otherwise it's religious buildings. So how do you get yourself on the map in a new society? Build a religious building, and then you're part of the sort of the fabric and the representation of the community. You can see, I can't get up here too much, but there are 2 very sort of, a few smaller buildings here. Here's the synagogue. I think that one is the Quaker meeting house. So the plainer folks in town, not the very grand churches that mark some of the Christian faiths there. But of course, it's significant that there were Jews in New York in this era. Okay, so what do we know about what it looked like inside? Here we have this very crude representation of the outside. What do we know about what was inside? Well, we don't have any images of it, but we do have sort of contemporaneous examples of synagogues. You can see this is in Curacao. This building is still here. The outside was grander in Curacao than it was in New York. Okay, so that's something for us to look at. But if you look at this interior, this is one that you're gonna see now show up a few times. I'm sorry about the microphone. The pillars that mark the space, the balconies that you see there. One of the things that's interesting about Curacao is the floor is made out of sand. Which is not the case we don't think it was the case at Mill Street in New York, and there are lots of sort of stories there in that community about why they have that sand floor, but I'm interested more in the hard shell as opposed to the soft sand. So if you look at this, so here's Curacao, referred to as the SNOA, from Esnoga for synagogue, 1732. Here's probably the model for that, which was in Amsterdam. Not New Amsterdam, but Amsterdam, This was a grand synagogue built in 1675, the Portuguese synagogue, the esnoga, right, the synagogue. And see that structure with the central sort of bima, as we say, the central prayer space, where they would read the prayers, the ark with the Torah at the front of the building, the pillars and the galleries that mark the space. This was a new model. It was introduced some decades earlier in an Amsterdam synagogue of integrating women, actually, into the synagogue. This was a new thing. Maybe if some of you have visited synagogues in Europe from earlier eras, even in this era, there'll be rooms off to the side. There'll be basement spaces with little grates up to the main floor. Actually, building this balcony into the space, galleried space, was a way to integrate women into the space, because in these synagogues, men and women sat separately. But it does represent that there was an expectation that women would be present in these spaces. Okay, so here's this space. It affected synagogue design all over Europe and all over the New World. So if you go to, say, Venice, you're going to see synagogues also smaller, but structured like this. Okay, so this is the oldest standing synagogue structure in the United States. We call it the Truro Synagogue now in Newport, Rhode Island. It was built in dedicated in 1763. I always ask, does it look like a synagogue? It doesn't look like Temple Emmanuel in Grand Rapids. But, you know, people didn't really know necessarily what a synagogue looked like. Here, as in Grand Rapids, they were building a synagogue in full view. They hired the most prominent architect in America who lived in Newport, Peter Harrison, to build this synagogue. And it fits well into the Newport landscape. You can tell it's a fancier building than just a house because it has these rounded windows and a little fancy portico at the door. Here's the interior. Okay, so again, I don't know if you can recognize that similar structure of the galleries and the pillars. Here, I'm comparing it to, again, another sort of contemporaneous synagogue, still there, Bevis Marks in London, which was built in 1701. So here you have a similar interior. Can anybody see what's different? Not those who already know this might remember this lecture from many years ago. What's different? Newport on the right, London on the left. What's different about the Newport Synagogue? What's that?
One's in color.
One's in color, that is different. I think if you go to London now, that's also in color. I just don't have, it's an older engraving of it. One's a photograph.
The chairs facing in a different direction?
They all face inward. They all face inward. So remember what our interest is in this particular lecture. Let's see if I can give you, okay.
Is the beer not in the center? And
Yes, they're both in the center. I'm gonna like, spoiler, what's that?
Women's section is larger.
What's different about the women's section? Look carefully in this one. What do you see? I don't know, everybody doesn't have the best view. There's a screen, right? There's sort of a built space, and then there's a screen above it. What do you see in the Newport one? It's more open. Okay.
and the one in the Virgin Islands in St. Thomas, they don't have a gallery.
They don't have a gallery.
No, they have the sand floor like
Ah.
hers. I've been to both.
Okay, I have to look into it.
Use that.
I have never gotten to go to like the Virgin Islands, and so I don't know. I need to go and see these places. And I actually, when I went to Amsterdam for the first time, I had been talking about it already for years, and I'm like, great, I get to go. It was winter. I went to services, but they were having it. It was too cold in the big synagogue, so it was in like some adjacent house. And then I went on the tourist thing, but of course you can't go in the gallery because for insurance reasons. So that was very frustrating. In Newport, I did get to go. I have been to that and sat in the gallery because that's what you do when you go to actual services, and if you're a woman. And this is a big difference, right? Is this lattice work, all of those other spaces, basically that balcony is much higher, opaque, or maybe a screen. And something happened in Newport. We don't find it in instructions to the architect at all. but a different sense of how women were going to be present in these spaces, as reflected in the ways that from the here on out, American synagogues were built, even as they continued to separate men and women. This was an open gallery. So right now, if you go to Newport, you're sitting far enough back that you might not be in evidence, but if you lean over the railing, you will be, and seen from down below. Okay, there it is. So what was going on? Why? There's no comment on it, and yet it's a change from the ways that synagogues continued to be built in Europe at this time, and the ways that everybody who were building these synagogues and occupying them, they would have been familiar with. Okay, so how did American, well, so colonial American Jews and those who were not Jewish see these spaces? So here are a couple observations from non-Jews who visited the Mill Street Synagogue, right? You can see in 1744, an observer said, "The women, of whom some were very pretty, stood up in the gallery like a hen coop." In 1812, "The women are in a gallery which has a breastwork as high as their chins." Did these seem to be like positive comments? No. Right there, it's judgmental, right? Like, what are they doing to the women, treating them like they're in a hen coop? I included this one. So Peter Harrison, that's the architect I mentioned. Again, we see the Newport Synagogue on the left. On the right this is from a bigger space, King's Chapel in Boston. And still there. You can go visit that, significant church. You can see that the feel of it isn't that different, right? It's not like, our synagogue historians have said, oh, on the outside, Newport looked like a, conventional building in Newport, but on the inside it was Jewish. And it did have the structure that we've seen, but it's not super different than the church, except, of course, all the sort of what happens is all at the front of the building. They didn't have a central, I don't know what we're calling this, altar. But otherwise, it's got the pillars, it's got the balcony. So what would be the difference? Who would sit in the balcony in American churches?
Black people.
Right, so we've seen that in To Kill a Mockingbird and other spaces, servants, children, right? The hierarchy in American churches it's not that men and women in every church sat next to each other. Some of them did, some of them separated, but they wouldn't have set them one group in the balcony and one below. So already we see in the mid 1700s and early 19th century, like this observation, look what's going on in those interesting synagogues. The women are, and so what I think that we see is a changing sense of women's presence in religious spaces, and the sense that, like, sort of blocking them off, making it look like they were in a hen coop, was problematic. And some other things that indicate this, before we move too far away from New York and Newport, was contention over women's place in those galleries, all right? So this is going back to our synagogue, this one. So what are some of the things that happened there? There were fights. In the synagogue gallery, where, for instance, Mr. Judah Mears went up into the gallery during Sabbath worship and turned Miss Josie Hayes from the seat, claiming that it was his daughter's seat. He was fined 40 shillings for the disruption. In 1792, there was a rule that was passed, or that was going to be passed, that no unmarried lady except Rachel Pinto be allowed to occupy a front seat in the gallery. And then I used to think Rachel Pinto was really old, but like she was almost 70, and so it was like not, all the other unmarried women presumably were younger, and so this sense of who deserves a front seat, it doesn't matter where you sit. In the Philadelphia synagogue, the shamus, the guy overseeing things in the synagogue, had to ascend to the gallery in 1825 to enforce the rules of the congregation. He told two sisters that only one of them could occupy their mother's seat, but neither of them moved. When he came down, he was accosted by their brother, who rejected his request to help him and told him, "Never go up again to my sisters or I will drag you down." And the point of these sort of fisticuffs in the synagogue, and sometimes they did turn into that, was that suddenly it mattered where these women sit, right? The young women wanted to be in the synagogue, they wanted to be in the front seat, and their family members, the male members of their family, were like engaged in sort of pushing others out or trying to protect their own family members. So anyway, that's what I see behind it, right? Also the fact that women in the Christian churches, going back to those charts that we saw about like the last few decades, this goes back into the 16th and 17th and 18th century in the United States, 16th, 17th and 18th century, right? Where women were showing up in American churches. Church was a place where women were expected to be. So even if in wherever these folks had come from, they were not accustomed as women to going to the synagogue, in colonial America, they understood that that was a place they wanted to be seen and should be seen. And we see quickly that this same design gets picked up in other places. So here's a synagogue from Charleston from 1794. Does that look like a synagogue? What does it look like to you? Church, right? So, well, a synagogue looks like whatever people think a religious building should look like in their space. If you go to Charleston now, the current synagogue, which was built in 1840, looks like a temple, a Greek temple or a bank, right? And then if you walk around, you'll see lots of churches that look like Greek temples and banks.
But it's the same congregation.
Same congregation.
Yeah, that's why we saw it a few years ago.
Right. So this building burned down in the 1838, I think, and built it again. But here's the interior, right? By now that should look familiar to you, right? And sort of that open space. This is a nice example, again, of a kind of similar space, though in a more rounded, and this is in Philadelphia. And in this case, occupied, right? An engraving that's occupied. What do you notice about it?
Looks like they're at the opera.
Looks like they're, so, okay, very elegant, right? The men are wearing top hats along with their prayer shawls, very elegant. What about the women? Very visible, also dressed up in their bonnets, right? But very, very visible, right? In the gallery, but visible. And then we have this comment from Rebecca Gratz, who is worth learning about in other contexts. Those of you who went to Jewish Sunday school, she invented it, so you have her to thank for that. But a very influential woman in Philadelphia in American Judaism. But she wrote to her brother, this is a new synagogue, right, 1824. She wrote in 1825. We all go to synagogue Friday evening as well as on Saturday morning. The gallery is as well filled as the other portion of the house. Right? Okay, remember we were saying at the beginning, we think of the synagogue as a place that's dominated by men. In traditional spaces, in general, women wouldn't have gone on Friday night at all because they'd be home getting supper ready. So this really reflects a different kind of practice. And she's saying this with some, meaning. The bottom and the top are equally filled, right? And some of these places, like in Mill Street, they actually had to expand the gallery because they didn't have enough place for women. So again, we're learning something about the importance of being there and that women are showing up. So what's the impact of that? So this is a document that I love from Cincinnati from 1853, which was a petition signed by about 20 women in the congregation. At the bottom, you can see some of their signatures in a variety of scripts, English, Yiddish, Hebrew. But here's a little excerpt from it. Usually I like to read straight from the text, but that takes longer. The undersigned ladies who regularly attend divine worship in the synagogue. Oh, wait. Who are they? They regularly attend divine worship in the synagogue, right? That's become now part of their identity. That's a new identity for Jewish women. Respectfully inform the members that the curtain which is placed before the railing, which divides their seats from those of the gents, was fastened down by them, but frequently torn again. They are in a temporary space in this year. Their old synagogue is being torn down to make space for a new one. So the usual gallery that they're a part of isn't there. Instead, they had to put a divider between men and women. And someone keeps tearing it down. The necessity of having their seats on the same floor in this temporary space with the gents which expose them to the public gaze, and which is strongly forbidden by our holy laws. Okay, so who's talking about sort of representing the demands of Judaism, right? It's these women who regularly attend divine service. The congregation, that is the men of the congregation, will confer a particular kindness by having the curtain fastened with the request that no person be allowed in any way to misplace it, etc. Okay, so what are they arguing for?
The greater separation.
They're arguing for separation. They're kind of saying whoever keeps knocking this over is actually not respecting our holy law, which means that men shouldn't be seeing the women, but also us, right? So please, like, pay attention to the space that is accorded to us, and don't let people kind of run roughshod over the separation. So we're seeing them, yeah.
Is it a movable,
Yeah, it's a curtain.
but I mean, or,
We don't know. This is all we know about it,
okay,
right? And it's a makeshift because they're in temporary space, so it's not like they built it,
right.
right? So they put something up to separate. That was part of their practice, their understanding, and now, they're asking, they're petitioning, right, themselves. They didn't say, oh, honey, go tell the president or the guy in charge. They're like, we're speaking as a group. We're the women who care about this synagogue, and we're asking you to respect us. So again, we're seeing kind of redefinition of a new kind of sense of self. I don't think we would have seen many Jewish women with this kind of collective sense in years before this. Again, sort of what's happening and how is this going to go? So we continue to see non-Jews very interested in American synagogues. These are two important cultural observers. Lydia Maria Child was a very important, influential sort of culture maker. She wrote Lady Godey's book, like an important magazine in the early 19th century. Walt Whitman, who we all should have heard of, the poet. Both visited Shearith Israel in New York, now a new space. And here, you know what I wrote, where the front of the gallery was open work. There was a debate about how to build it. In this case, it was explicit. There was a debate about how to build that balcony. And they decided and they voted in favor of open work, right? And so you see a representation of that. So now they're conscious that we want to make this, it's not exactly the way tradition that we grew up with demands, but we're creating a different kind of space here. Okay, so Lydia Maria Child and Walt Whitman, actually, they both go to see like this evocation of the Orient, right? That's what they're expecting in the synagogue. So this child goes in, I had turned away from the turmoil of the present to gaze quietly for a while on the grandeur of the past, right? So this tells us something about how she thought about Jews and Judaism. And what happened? The representatives of the past walked before me, not in the graceful Oriental turban that she was hoping for, but the useful European hat. It broke the illusion completely. She also didn't like their sort of modern trousers. One of the masters of Israel somewhat gruffly ordered me to retire from the front seats of the synagogue. It was uncourteous, for we were very respectful, and still, and not in the least disposed to intrude upon the daughters of Jacob. So she was going in as an observer, trying to see sort of this mystical Orient. She was disturbed because the men were walking around like with top hats on. And then she was treated like a daughter of Israel. Like she didn't think of herself. She was like a modern Western woman. I have nothing to do with these sort of Oriental figures. And they made me go sit with those women, and we were disturbed. We didn't want to disturb them. She didn't see herself as someone who a modern Western woman would be exiled to the balcony. Walt Whitman enjoyed his visit. He said of the synagogue gallery, it was filled with women, dark-eyed Jewesses, by no means the most unpleasing sight in the whole proceeding. We found ourselves casting our glances thither quite frequently. So again, do you think sort of the Jews in their hats and trousers would like observations like this? It's not who they wanted to be, right? They didn't want to be seen as sort of evocations of a mystical, dark-eyed Orient. They wanted to be modern figures and modern participants in society. So even though they had opened up the gallery, it still sort of created sort of this like harem-like atmosphere in the synagogue. And that's the way that non-Jews saw it. So what was going to happen? Well, they kept changing. So here you see something different, right? Instead of just the open balcony, what's happened here? Right? They're in tiers, right? It's like stadium seating. And this is from the Shet Israel building of 1860. But there was an observation, but this was being more and more common. So what happened in these spaces? This is Leo Merzbacher, who was the sort of the rabbi figure of Temple Emmanuel in New York in 56 there. The empathy, describing this kind of design. The amphitheatrical seats of the female order in the gallery above presents to the gaze of everyone the whole array of female beauty in the upper region and vice versa, affording also the opportunity of a constant telegraphic communication at the twinkling of an eye to all parts of the house. All right, this too, very problematic. This is not what you go to synagogue for, right? It's like this vertical flirting back and forth. So so in a way, there's an argument. The separation is about sort of keeping men and women separate, keeping everything decorous. Well, what's happening instead, and there are lots of kind of crazy comments on and on about sort of all of the communications going on between the upper and lower parts of the house throughout comments on this. This became problematic. So what's it going to lead to?
It's almost like there's no, if they're separate, there's still comments about the ladies, and
Right.
if they were together.
Right. Actually, I realized I left out sort of the best picture, so I'm going to have to act it out. So what happens in Merzbacher's synagogue, Temple Emmanuel in New York, you see the 1868 version here, is instead of that, it no longer looks like the inside of a synagogue. Instead of that central bima, the central altar, it's pushed to the front. The audience is in rows, and at the front, and this is a great picture, there's a guy going like, and you're like, who is important in this picture? Is it any of the people in the seats? Men and women now are seated together in family pews, which took care of that problem, right? You raise an interesting question, right? Are they going to be criticized anyway? But now they can say, now each woman, the guardian angel of her family, can be right where she should be by their side, right? So that is a much more decorous, much more appropriate way of men and women behaving together, right? You're taking away that frisson of telegraphic communication. So all of these buildings, built after the Civil War, when there was a lot of wealth in many of the Jewish communities in the North, had family pews. In the middle of Cincinnati, two from New York on either side. But you can see this really grandeur of the architecture, and also spaces, if you look at that inside of Plum Street Temple, some of us have been there, you're not very important in that space. It's a very grand space. And so there's this weird thing now of men and women sitting next to each other. In some ways, we might say that's more equal, but actually they're all kind of now quiet. The person at the front is important, that guy. The rest, as one of the quotes says, someone said, the rest play mere dummies. Apart from occasional rising from the seat, they are just there basically as an audience. Okay, so things have changed. Yeah?
There's still, though, contemporary. We went to the great synagogue of Sydney, which looks like what you showed. The president was a woman, but she only could come out of the balcony to give the announcement. So
this is important to know, and I'm not showing you a lot more of these. This is sort of mid-19th century. This becomes a pattern of American synagogues, except for the original Sephardic synagogues, Shearith Israel, Mikveh in New York, Mikveh Israel in Philadelphia, a few others that were kept their sort of minhag, their practice, and kept the separate seating. All of these others moved towards mixed seating until the arrival of Eastern European Jews towards the end of the century reintroduced sort of among non-Sephardic Jews that more traditional practice and separation. But if, for instance, any of you ever visit Eldridge Street Synagogue in New York, there's a balcony, and it's huge, right? It's not just like, a row and people didn't go. So even sort of this early Eastern European traditional synagogue where men and women were going to be separated recognized that in America, women were going to be seen and be present in the synagogue. And it's amphitheatrical as well, right? So that too changed. Okay, so we've talked a lot about Architecture, you can see I like to talk about architecture. So I'll just move quickly through the other things that I was going to mention. But I hope it sort of makes the point that, like, what happened was women's presence restructured the shape of American Judaism, right? Synagogues with family pews are much different than those synagogues sort of that are separate. And often they would build a new synagogue because they were like, we need to get up to date. We need to get rid of this balcony and have a place where men and women can sit together. I include this early building from Temple Emmanuel in Grand Rapids from 1881, again to emphasize the importance of this synagogue, right? This was a small community, right? You can see the investment and care that's given to this space. This was not as grand as these buildings, right? But it represents the same thing. And I also want to point out that all of these buildings are mainly sanctuary, right? That's all there is to them. They had, in Cincinnati, we know, they had basements where they would do everything else. The congregational meetings, the religious schools, they were just big sanctuaries with a few auxiliary spaces. And because of that, synagogues actually didn't do much. So now we have a case where women are sitting with men, but they're actually not doing that much else around the synagogue. This was not true for Christian women. Christian women after the Civil War were extremely active in the public space. You had the temperance movement on top. You had missionary societies on the bottom. You had raising money to support those things. In the Catholic Church, of course, you had women religious who were very engaged as religious figures and very important. Jewish women now were part of, many of them, these very prosperous, let's say here, spaces. But the things that they had been doing to be religious, that is taking care of their home, keeping kosher, all of those things in these communities had become less important. So they did show up in synagogues, in fact, outnumbering men quite a bit, upsetting synagogue leaders, where are all the men? But the synagogues weren't doing much else than having these prayer services in these big spaces and sometimes bemoaning the lack of men and the lack of numbers there. Okay, so what happened? Oh, something did happen, yeah.
The previous pictures of the synagogue, I mean, with the rise of American Reform Judaism in the mid-1800s, is this more?
These are more Reform.
These are more
Reform, but synagogues that were also sort of what we would call conservative, right? That were trying to do a more traditional version and not as extreme Reform. Also, we're seeing these changes, also introduced mixed seating. So you didn't necessarily have that like modern Orthodox space. Okay, what happened? A whole bunch of more poor Jews came to the United States. And suddenly there was a lot to do. And you see an explosion of women's activity in every city. I'm sure it was true in Grand Rapids, where suddenly there were all these activities.
Are you talking first wave, second wave?
So this is starting sorry, I should be more specific. Right, so starting in the 1880s and through 1920, continuing waves of impoverished immigrants coming from Eastern Europe and Russia and other parts of the world, including Sephardic communities, and they needed a lot of help. And so women got busy and created schools, created vocational opportunities, raised money, settlement houses, so many different things, and getting organized. They eventually organized themselves. So in 1893, you had the Jewish Women's Congress ordered in Chicago at the Columbian Exposition, World's Fair, the World Parliament of Religion. They wanted to be part of the Jewish Congress that was going to be held there, but they wouldn't give them a chance to read one paper. They said all they wanted us to do was move around the chairs and arrange the chairs. So they held their own convention, and it was a hot ticket. Women elbowed, trod on each other's toes, and did everything else they could without violating the proprieties to get into the hall. And it opened up a whole new space, right? A whole new space, as Rebecca Kohut said. A desire to work had been awakened where before there was only lethargy. Energies only waiting for a channel into which to throw themselves had been properly directed. And here you have a newspaper, right, for American Jewish women that came out of this and argued for women's sort of emancipation in the synagogue and argued for women to be part of the governance of synagogues and of their communities. It really activated, as she said, something that just had been dormant. Here's a gathering of the National Council of Jewish Women, which was founded out of that Congress. Here they are in 1926 at the White House, having a say. Other organizations started. Hadassah was created in 1912, and within a year had sent these visiting nurses to Palestine to care for all the population there. This led to the creation of movements within the synagogue movements, the National Council of Jewish Women, that's a group on the steps there. Matilda Schachter created the Women's League and the conservative movement in 1913 for the National Federation of Temple Sisterhoods, 1918 for the Women's League, 1926 for the Orthodox Women's Group. And they all, I don't have time, I'm going to read you what they did in Cleveland. They came home from that conference in Cincinnati, where they created the National Federation of Temple Sisterhoods, and they immediately had a meeting to reorganize the women's work of the temple. Within 3 weeks, they had 528 members, and they had organized a congregational seder and established a committee structure, okay, 3 weeks after that meeting. A year later, they had 760 members and 26 working committees. And I could go through all of them, and it's like ridiculous, all the things they did. So synagogues that had done very little besides have these services suddenly were doing all this work in their own community and beyond. And see these buildings, one from Cleveland, one from Detroit. These were founded in many different cities. These are not just sanctuaries, right? Look at that Detroit one. You're seeing mainly the sanctuary, but they have all this back end, all these classrooms, all these meeting rooms, all these social spaces, because suddenly they're not only having seders, right? They're having Oneg Shabbat, things that they didn't do before. They didn't have a congregational life, and now they did. And it was all due to sort of women being actively engaged. And so the synagogue, again, the congregation is being redefined, right? It's doing a whole other work in the world than what they had done before. I noted this building. I was just asking Rabbi Katapan about like what the original structure was there. This is an early kind of suburban synagogue, but interesting in that it's very evident from the street. In a lot of other places, when they set back, they also are kind of hidden. Here, very evident, like a city synagogue, and I suspect had a good amount of sort of infrastructure space to do classrooms, to do other activities, right, that made it more than just a sanctuary. All right, total jump, because we're done, but Jewish women, again, not here in the synagogues, but changed our society, right? The leaders, thought leaders and activists in the feminist movement, many, many, many of them were Jewish. And that obviously had an impact not just on all society, but on American Judaism. So here quickly, we're looking at the first women who were ordained in the different religious movements in Judaism, and a picture of them all together. Not that many years ago, right? We're still so close to this change. What did it mean for these communities, for these buildings to have women in charge? It meant, oh, okay, here we are. So this is celebrating the 25th anniversary of Sally Priesand's ordination with the members of the Hebrew Union College student community and me, and these two as well, which is crazy. So here we are again, celebrating a change in the world. You are there, right? Where is Rabbi Katapan? We do not know. What has it meant? What has it meant? Okay, this is again sort of a breaking down and a reconfiguration and a reimagination, right? Having women in these roles as religious leaders has just opened up sort of basically everything, right? Opened up theology. What do we mean? Oh, should we call God He? Well, I don't know. What do I mean by God? Suddenly, boom, tons of theological questions, different ways of approaching community, right? Not that big guy at the front, but thinking about spirituality, opening the way for the LGBTQ folks in the community. And a lot of the religious movements, it was the women's groups that sort of led the way and insisting on having those conversations. And not just now in liberal movements, right? But now we have Orthodox female rabbis, and sort of the implications of that, right? There's just in some places, of course, there's a lot of still resistance to that, but there exists this whole reimagination of what the community, identity, possibility can be. And I think I'm just finishing here, almost. Again, going back to spaces, right? What does it mean to have women in these spaces? Well, ICAR is a very dynamic community in Los Angeles. They were sort of kind of informal community. They never wanted to be like mainstream, but now they're building a space. But they're reimagining what that space might be, right? For what does community mean now, right? Does it mean a huge sanctuary? They have a lot of folks who show up. Inside, outside, building into it, perhaps infrastructure for others in the community. Here, I thought this was interesting. In Buffalo, you can see, look what's happened. The seats are facing in again, right, toward each other in this very light-filled space. And they are just the first universal design certified religious space in the country, meaning accessibility for everybody, and thinking about that, putting that at the center of their work. And here's from Temple Beth Zion in Brookline. It's a building from 1947, but can you see this on the right, the way they use the space, this reimagination of what it means to bring community together, right? And women's leadership has really opened up space for everyone to rethink all of these questions. So, maybe Christianity has stopped declining. You know, maybe it's like flattening out. What's happening at this bottom, it's just a line, right? But throughout, if we follow that line through these decades and the decades coming ahead, there's so much more sort of life and possibility that has informed that line. We don't know what's going to happen to religion in American society, but there's just a lot more possibility and dynamism because it's a space that keeps on changing. And obviously, bringing women into this Jewish space that was always imagined as a male space has just meant that space over now centuries has meant much more to American Jews than it might have in earlier centuries. So, happy to take your questions.
Oh, sorry, I'm going to run the microphone. So welcome to shoot a hand up if you have a question.
Yes.
Why do you think, why do you think that all of a sudden the emergence of women, they're called rabbinants mostly in Orthodox, and I see that because I'm studying Talmud. There's a woman in Israel, she has people all over the world that log on like at midnight Eastern time for her class. There's somebody in Philadelphia that runs a class. Guy Lafine has just published a book. What do you attribute that?
So in the early 1980s, I think 1983, Blue Greenberg wrote a book called on Women in Judaism, Women in Judaism. And she is an Orthodox woman, definitely on the sort of liberal side of politics. And she said, within my lifetime, we're going to see Orthodox women rabbis. And I think a lot of people said, that's not going to happen. And she made the argument that what was happening then and what we saw over the 1980s and 1990s was that women were getting access to textual study that hadn't been accessible to women before. And her point was, once you have the learning, then you have the authority. What does authority come from in Judaism? It comes from knowledge. It comes from being learned. And once women have that learning, then the other sort of authorities, male authorities, aren't going to be able to say, no, you're wrong. You don't know, little lady, right? Some of them still say that, of course, right? But basically, what's interesting in this move, so all the changes, so this is an interesting sort of comparison of what happened to, on these lines, right? What was happening in Christianity and what was happening in Judaism. In Christianity, we saw from sort of Reagan on, right, like a return to sort of more fundamentalist religion. And you have that in Judaism, right? You have a strong Orthodox movement, and that's appealing to many, maybe who didn't start there. But the majority of American Jews are not Orthodox. And so, whereas in American Christianity, if you follow the trends, right, there were some struggles in liberal movements, but around like gay issues, it was all, religion is about rejecting, right, new sexualities that we don't recognize. And we're hearing it today about gender, right, like not recognizing that. The logic in American Judaism could not run that way, right? The conservative movement, for instance, I didn't point out the dates when they first ordained women in these different movements, but they didn't ordain women for a while the Reform and Recon movements were. They didn't ordain openly gay rabbis while the Reform and the Reconstructionist movement were. And they couldn't sustain that, right? Because if they were gonna be a liberal religion in America, and others were doing these things, they couldn't argue for responding to the needs of the society if they didn't sort of open up to that possibility. So they had to find a way to do it. You would think there was certainly one of the things that began to define Orthodox religion in this time was pushing it back against those changes, right? It's like, oh, we're not like the Reform, we're not like the conservative, mainly around gender. Like that was a great way to argue it. It was a little unclear whether Orthodox religions would introduce mixed seating or not. There were lots of Orthodox communities that did see women and men together, but it became a way to define themselves as Orthodox to say, oh no, we have women and men seated separately. But that logic still affected them, so that young girls and women began to get access to studying texts. How could you say, I mean, they have said, it's not for women, but as they sort of had more access to secular knowledge, why would you, if all the men are going to study at yeshiva in Jerusalem, why shouldn't the girls? And they began to do that. And with that knowledge, then you have to ask, well, once somebody has that knowledge, what questions are they going to ask? What are they going to do differently? And will they see things differently than the men? I mean, there was a lot of, we went through the last whatever years, in 5 seconds. I mean, there's a lot of tension in that change, right? It introduced lots of possibility, but a lot of women paid, heavy prices for trying to move into a space that had always been seen as men, and are still paying that price, and as have, gay and lesbian and transgender and bisexual and transgender rabbis. So there's a lot of pain in those spaces, but there's still a lot of possibility, and it's so significant that it's affected Orthodox as well. It tells you sort of the pervasiveness of that change. And it's led in America. It gets picked up in other places, right? There are things that only happen in an exchange. Like there's a community in Jerusalem filled with very knowledgeable men and women have a strong say, but that was created in America, right? The folks who created it met at a conference in America and said, oh, what can we do in Jerusalem? In the US, they didn't have people with enough knowledge and openness to do it, but they could bring it back to Jerusalem and do it. So it was very transnational.
Yeah, I was curious if you could make any comments about...
Sorry, one sec.
Thank you for a wonderful talk. I was enjoying thinking about Judaism and contrasting that with Christianity and Islam in terms of the role of women in the past 150, 200 years. Have you seen similar things, or what's different, what's the same?
Yeah, it's a great question, right? Well, so American Christianity is bigger, right? It has lots more groups with lots more critical mass. We have seen the liberal mainstream sort of Christian groups declining. And that's why I'm kind of, that's a little bit different, because they've been challenged by sort of a more fundamentalist kind of approach that is doubling down in some ways on separate gender roles and on exclusions of those who don't seem quite the same. I think Islam is a really fascinating, and of course you have places that are very liberal and became models for Jews. And you also have other kinds of religious movements going on, right? Just in that last slide, right? You're picking up on things that are going on elsewhere in society. Meditation, right? Like Eastern religions, mindfulness. There's the American religion has this possibility, like American culture, of drawing from lots of different sources. So you have all those varieties in American Christianity. Islam is so fascinating because, in a way, the critical mass, right, of immigrants who are Muslim overall came later to the United States than most of the American Jewish community. And so they're not going to assimilate in the same way. They might not want to in the first place. We know American Jews wanted to feel part of the general culture, right? They wanted to build great buildings on the street that would be recognized by others. So do a lot of Muslim groups. But now I think there's more room for difference in American culture, in part because look at sort of ultra-Orthodox Jews who said we're going to set up our community in opposition to the surrounding community. So I think newer immigrant groups have to figure that out for themselves, right? Like how much America is powerful, right? It's a powerful force in saying if you want to belong, there are ways to do it. Some folks have more access to that than others, right? One of the things that white American Jews had access to was a sense of, well, we can pass, like we don't always have to feel different. Other groups with different skin color and whatever don't have that same sort of option. But the desire, I said something at the beginning about cultures that care about how others see them. You think about Muslim culture here, that outside gaze is also very important. Part of it is like has been surveillance since 2001, right? Since 9/11. So that there is a concern about how others see you and a danger in that. And so what do you do then? Do you try and be more like the people watching you want you to be, or do you sort of stand up against that? So I guess what I'm saying is these different groups are like navigating different terrain. One of the places that I feel this, for me, like going to, one of the things I studied was black churches that are in buildings that used to be synagogues. And that's a really interesting space for me because I've thought a lot about how the folks who prayed there as Jews thought they should behave, right? And we saw, I'm sorry I left out that picture of that very formal congregation, because overall it's like, oh, we should be quiet, we should be careful, we shouldn't yell, we shouldn't fall on the floor. But if you go to a black church in those same places where I've gone, there are people yelling, there are people falling on the floor. And there's this question of like how, in both cases, you're looking at a group that's trying to maintain a distinctive identity in the midst of, sort of what might be seen as a more homogenous collective. They're trying to maintain a distinctive religious tradition, but with different sort of leanings into what others might expect them to be. And in those black churches that I was studying, right, they had felt, it was like, well, they're not, this was my interpretation, right? We're not really going to be seen as fitting in anyway. We may as well have our own practice, right? And a lot of white American Jews, maybe, felt more constrained. The Reform movement, we have some representatives, religious leaders here, went pretty far in the 19th century to be very controlled, very still, very far from Hebrew, from traditional practices, because they really felt like if we do that, we're going to feel pretty much like those around us. And there's not been a lot of pushback against that kind of thing. Those traditional behaviors and songs and movements maybe are part of what it feels like to be Jewish, and I shouldn't go so far away from it. So I don't know. I don't have a good answer actually, but it's a really interesting space to watch.
So I have about 50 years of memories just rolling around in my head, and hopefully they'll come to a question. The reason I asked about whether or not the pictures were of the Reform congregation versus either conservative or Orthodox was because I started thinking about how the movements happen in segments. I grew up in a place just outside of Philadelphia, Westchester, Pennsylvania. I actually looked back at the synagogue that I grew up in. There's some pictures online. I remember the balcony. It was a synagogue started in the late 1800s by German and Russian immigrants coming to the town. The town is only about 25,000 until the university's in session, and then it's 50,000. So you can see that the town is very insulated. But it had the separate, I remember clearly that you had distinction between where the women were sitting, where the men were sitting. However, it was a conservative synagogue. And during that time of my growing up, my bar mitzvah and things like that, I would go every Saturday with my dad to synagogue and never never would you see a woman in the synagogue on Saturdays. Friday nights, different story. Saturdays, not so, nobody. 10 of us at most, maybe 12. And then I went away for an exchange year in a land that had 500 Jews, Finland, where they were very difficult to find. And when I came back, it felt like the world exploded. Well, at least the Jewish world exploded. Because after that, I ended up going to Brandeis. Okay, there it's a totally different ballgame again, where the Orthodox Jews had the curtain between the men and the women's side on Friday night and Saturday morning. But when I went to the conservative high holidays, they had a woman cantor, which I'd never faced before, especially not in a conservative setting. And my initial reaction was, I can't stay in this. I need to go more toward the Orthodox. And then circumstances happen, and my mother becomes the president of the synagogue. Now you've got the first woman president of a synagogue. And then it becomes that then we get the first woman rabbi in the mid to late 90s. So here's where the question comes in. In the late 1800s, after the reform movement sweeps into America and starts to take sort of hold, you see this dramatic shift of women getting more involved.
Right.
It wasn't really in the conservative movement that you see this sweep, at least from my understanding and my experience, that really it wasn't until late 80s, early 90s, late 90s, that women became much more involved, much more prominent in a conservative synagogue. And now you're saying that even the Orthodox are coming into having women more involved and have a greater role.
Right.
Is this then that final wave of getting women integrated throughout the various levels, however you want to describe it, of Judaism?
Do we have anywhere to go? Anywhere else to go with this? Well, no, because our suggestion is this is going to keep evolving, right? Now we have other sort of gender challenges that we didn't imagine 30 years ago. So, going so quickly through this, I feel like I was like a little fuzzy around some of these things, but in the conservative movement as well as the reform movement, the movement from like sort of the 1890s on it wasn't religious leadership, right? But it was like social leadership, which had religious aspects to it, right? So the National Federation of Temple Sisterhoods very early on introduced, for instance, a sisterhood Sabbath. And the idea was the rabbi would get up and talk about how great the women in the congregation were. But very quickly, the women in the congregation said, no, we don't want to do it that way. We want to lead the service. We want to give the sermon. And that showed maybe once a year this model, right, of where women would lead. Camps, right? Camps introduced sort of a more in the conservative movement as well as the reform movement. But I think it was especially important in the conservative movement. More opportunities for girls. Is famously, Susanna Heschel is someone, the daughter of Abraham Joshua Heschel, who taught at the Jewish Theological Seminary, a very important social justice and religious leader. And she was someone who grew up in the seminary, went to those camps, and then, was someone who would have been a rabbi. But then, and that you have conservative rabbis in their meetings, right, reflecting, well, we hate saying no to Susie Heschel, right? Like, how does that make any sense, right? But there are lots of girls who grew up maybe in camps, getting to lead services, having access to it. The bat mitzvah, not everywhere, because it sounds like your congregation was conservative, but with a very orthodox edge. But bat mitzvahs really emerged more in the conservative movement than in the reform movement, with limitations on it. I mean, my bat mitzvah was 3 years after my sister's, and it was totally different. Right? She had a Friday night, read the Haftorah. Mine was Saturday morning, read the Torah. Like, things happened quickly in this space. Like you said, like you went away, everything had changed. But that's what the feminist movement did, right? And sort of, Sally Priesand, who was the first ordained American woman rabbi, she wasn't there. She got to Cincinnati in 1964. This was before, it was after the feminine mystique, but before really sort of women's feminism or women's liberation had hit, she wanted to be a rabbi. You know, she'd gone to camp, she liked being Jewish, and she didn't really pay attention to them saying, yeah, no, girls don't do that. She just like hung around and made her way through. And by the time she was ordained, the women's movement was happening, right? It took like another 10 years for the reform movement, sort of the number of women applying to begin to approach, the number of men. So things are happening at different time frames in different ways, right? But they're changing everywhere. Even in like somehow, how did your mother get to be president? Like things had been happening, right? Like she had probably been very involved in different ways. Maybe not going to services, right? But there are other ways to define the community. And this sort of era of these synagogues. Sorry, way back here. Like these and this, right? Men were in charge. They were the rabbis, they ran the boards. Some women were pushing and saying, put women on the school committee. They said, well, maybe you can like put the curtains up, right? Like they found literals, you can keep the bathrooms clean, right? But they kept pushing, right? And the creation of these organizations gave them a platform so that after 1893, more women appeared on synagogue committees. After the creation of these women's groups, more women were put on synagogue's board. After the passage of the suffrage amendment in 1920, more women, right, and access to membership were introduced. So it kind of followed the culture, but again, sort of in different sort of time frames.
So, sorry, Professor Golden, I have a question from our online community, and I promise we didn't plant this one. Can you please comment on the roles of women and men in interfaith efforts and organizations in the U.S.?
Interfaith efforts, that's interesting. I mean, most of the people that I can think of from within the Jewish community, like that, those feel like male movements to me. Like as they arose, like the National Conference of Christians and Jews. Now, I mean, interfaith is interesting, right? It used to mean Protestant Catholic Jew. Nowadays, I feel like it's mainly feels like Jewish Muslim, right? And sort of Christians, who needs to talk to them? I don't know. I like that in some ways, like those are the gaps that seem to need to be crossed. And I do feel like there are more women involved in those conversations today. Like if you look at sort of civic engagement projects in California and whatever, there are a lot of women leaders in that. But sort of the early emergence of it in the late 40s, 1950s, not surprisingly, was kind of a male-led movement, except for some very important things. So, in the civil rights movement, one of the most powerful things that happened was they would get these trios of a black woman, a Jewish woman, and a Protestant woman, and they would go around together to show that these groups could work together and sort of engage communities to think about like how do we make our society better, right? So those were very that was a strong movement and a strong interfaith and sort of really trying to model like a different world. We're not creating sort of organizations to, I don't know, that's sort of some high level of discourse, but to go right into the communities and try to get them in the guts. Yeah.
When you think about the future and you're analyzing where things are going, have you looked at birth rates as a factor in these different movements? And I'd be interested very much in your comments on that.
Well, a big issue as, the Jewish community looks at itself and thinks about how it's reframing, right? Like a lot of, you kind of asked, have we gotten to the, have we sort of like gotten an engagement like throughout all these levels, or we've gotten to where we're going to get to? here we are in our society. I often talk about in my classes about sort of these different models of American diversity, right? And I'm not thinking exactly about birth rates, but I'm going to get to it. We start in the 20th century, went through a number of concepts that were framed by Jewish thinkers: the melting pot, cultural pluralism, Protestant Catholic Jew, right? These are all sort of models of America. The statue, give me you're tired, you're poor, you're wretched, yearning to be free. These are all Jewish articulations of the possibilities of America. And some of those presumed that we would preserve difference, right? And we're struggling now with, right, what are we exactly struggling with? What does it mean to be a multi-race, pluralistic society? As some American Jewish communities look ahead, they're like, okay, well, are we going to be Jewish, right? Like, it has to do with birth rates, but it also has to do with mixed heritage families, right? And what the children are going to end up being. So that's been a big concern in the Jewish communal mind for many decades, and which is shifting, importantly, by the way, right? Like, when we were all in Cincinnati together, it was this sort of like looming terror of, oh no, it's going to fall apart because Jews are going to be marrying non-Jews, and now it's like was a fate to be avoided, right? And that's just really shifted now because this is the reality of American society, and there's a lot of possibilities saying, oh wow, maybe there are a lot more Jews out there if they marry other people who are not Jewish. Obviously, I think, when we talked about sort of fundamentalist versus more liberal religions, fundamentalist groups, whether in the United States or in Israel, tend to have more children. And so that one sort of factor in the line of the strength of these communities is you have to keep having children. So I don't know, a lot of times particularly now, you look at the future, it looks, whatever axis you're looking on, it can look bleak for whatever the future of the community you're thinking of, and yet we go along with faith, it's going to be different. Whatever the birth rates are, whatever the sort of intermarriage rates are, however interfaith works, right? I don't think that these traditions are going to go totally out of style. If they have the strength and they have the vitality that a lot of these changes have brought to them, they're going to have a future, and we just don't know what it's going to look like. Maybe fewer people, I don't know, in certain spaces. You good?
Doug's giving me the finger, so. Not that finger, the wiggle finger. Would you please join me in thanking Dr. Carl? We want to continue the conversation, so by all means, please make your way out the room and to the left. In the Gordon Gallery, we have a lovely reception set up where you can connect with our speaker, with our friends from the Frankel Center, and with the Kaufman staff. So we'll see you over there. Thank you so much for coming this evening.